Something extraordinary happened in the waters of the Middle East, and most Americans have no idea what it actually means. The United States Navy just conducted a strike on an Iranian warship, not a proxy militia boat, not a Houthi-operated vessel, an Iranian warship, and the weapon used, the long-range anti-ship missile, the LRASM, fired from an F/A-18 Super Hornet, is not a weapon you deploy casually. It is one of the most sophisticated, stealthy, and lethally precise anti-ship missiles in the entire American arsenal. Its use here is a statement, a deliberate, calculated, unmistakable statement. Now, I want you to think carefully about what this moment represents, not just militarily, but geopolitically, strategically, and in terms of where the United States now stands in relation to Iran, to the broader Middle East power structure, and frankly, to the entire global order that has been shifting quite dramatically right before our eyes. Because when America fires a weapon of this caliber at a sovereign nation's naval vessel, we have crossed a threshold. And crossing thresholds, as history consistently and soberly reminds us, rarely comes without consequence. Let us begin, as we always should, with the facts as we understand them, because in moments like this, clarity is everything, and confusion serves no one except those who wish to manipulate the narrative. The United States Navy, operating in the region, deployed F/A-18 Super Hornets carrier-based strike fighters, some of the most capable multi-role aircraft in any Navy's inventory in the world today, and from those aircraft they launched the LRASM, the long-range anti-ship missile, against an Iranian naval vessel. Now I want to take a moment here, before we get into the geopolitical consequences, to actually explain what the LRASM is and why its use in this context is so profoundly significant, because I think many people hear the word missile and they think of something rather generic. The LRASM is anything but generic. It is in every sense of the term a generational weapon system. The LRASM was developed by Lockheed Martin and DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, precisely because the United States military recognized in the early 2010s that its existing anti-ship missile inventory was becoming obsolete in the face of modern adversary naval defenses. The old Harpoon missile, which had served the United States Navy faithfully since the 1970s, was simply no longer sufficient against modern integrated air defense systems mounted on sophisticated naval platforms. So the LRASM was designed to be something fundamentally different. It is stealthy, meaning it has a reduced radar cross-section, making it extremely difficult to detect and track on radar. It flies at low altitude, hugging the surface of the water, using terrain following and sea skimming flight profiles that make interception extraordinarily challenging even for the most capable naval defense systems. And critically, and this is the part that really sets it apart, the LRASM uses autonomous guidance systems. It can navigate complex threat environments, identify its target, and choose its own attack angle and point of impact with a level of precision that is genuinely remarkable. This is not a dumb weapon, this is an intelligent one. So when the United States chose to use the LRASM in this strike, they were not simply reaching for whatever happened to be on the shelf. They made a deliberate choice to deploy one of their most capable, most sophisticated, and most expensive anti-ship weapons in their inventory. And that choice carries meaning. It tells us something about how seriously Washington viewed this target, and perhaps more importantly, it tells us something about the message Washington intended to send, not just to Tehran, but to every naval power in the world that is watching this closely. And believe me, they are all watching. Beijing is watching. Moscow is watching. Pyongyang is watching. Every government that operates a navy and considers the United States a potential adversary is taking very careful notes right now. Now let us step back and think about the broader context in which this strike occurred, because no military action happens in a vacuum. Iran's naval forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy and the regular Iranian Navy have been a source of persistent tension in the Persian Gulf and the broader waters of the Middle East for decades now. Iran has used its naval presence, its fast attack boats, its mining capabilities, and its influence over Houthi forces in Yemen to project power and to challenge American and Allied naval supremacy in the region, and the United States, for many years, has responded to Iranian provocations with a kind of carefully calibrated restraint, a restraint that was sometimes criticized as weakness, but which was in reality a deliberate strategic choice to avoid escalation into a full-scale conflict that nobody frankly wanted. But something appears to have changed, and that change is what we really need to understand today. Because the use of the LRASM against an Iranian warship is not restraint. It is the opposite of restraint. It is a decisive, kinetic, lethal act directed at a vessel belonging to the sovereign state of Iran, and that fundamentally alters the dynamic that has governed American-Iranian military relations for the better part of 4 decades. Think about what Iran will now be calculating in Tehran. The leadership of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards commanders, the naval chiefs, they are sitting in rooms right now having conversations that are deeply serious, because here is their dilemma. If they do not respond, they appear weak, and for a regime whose entire ideological foundation rests on resistance to American power, on the narrative of standing firm against what they call the Great Satan, appearing weak is existentially dangerous, not just externally, but internally. The Iranian population is watching. The hardliners within the regime are watching. The various proxy groups across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the various Shia militias in Iraq, they are all watching to see how Tehran responds to this moment. Because their own confidence, their own willingness to continue operating as instruments of Iranian regional power depends in part on believing that Iran itself is capable of defending its assets and projecting strength. But here is the other side of that dilemma. If Iran does respond, if Tehran orders a retaliatory strike against American naval assets, or against American bases in the region, or against Allied targets, then it risks triggering a far larger and far more devastating American military response, and Iran knows with absolute clarity that in a direct conventional military confrontation with the United States Navy and the broader American military apparatus, it cannot win. It simply cannot. The gap in conventional military capability is too large. American carrier strike groups, with their layers of air defense, their submarines, their surface combatants, their strike aircraft, they represent a concentration of military power that Iran has no realistic ability to overcome in a sustained conventional conflict. So Iran is caught between two deeply uncomfortable options. Respond and risk massive escalation. Do not respond and suffer a serious blow to its prestige and deterrence. And how Tehran navigates this dilemma will tell us an enormous amount about where this situation is heading. Now, I want to talk about the F/A-18 Super Hornet for a moment, because I think it's important to understand what kind of platform actually delivered this strike and why that matters. The F/A-18 Super Hornet is the backbone of United States carrier aviation. It is a twin-engine multi-role fighter and strike aircraft that can conduct air-to-air combat, precision ground strikes, electronic warfare, and yes, anti-ship strikes, all from the deck of a carrier operating hundreds of miles away from any friendly land base. The fact that this strike was carrier-based is itself significant. It means the United States did not need a land base in the region to conduct this operation. It did not need permission from Saudi Arabia or the UAE or any other regional partner to launch this strike. The carrier is, in effect, American sovereign territory moving through international waters, and it gives Washington a power projection capability that is essentially independent of regional political constraints. That is an enormously important strategic advantage, and it is one that Iran, for all its regional influence, simply does not possess. The combination of the F/A-18 and the LRASM creates what military planners call a standoff strike capability, meaning the aircraft that fires the missile never needs to get close enough to the target to be in range of its defenses. The LRASM has a range of well over 300 nautical miles, which means the F/A-18 crew could have launched their weapons while remaining entirely outside the engagement envelope of any Iranian air defense system on that vessel. The Iranian sailors on that warship, in all probability, had very little, if any, warning before the missile struck. That is how effective this weapon system is, and again, that is a message, a very loud, very clear message. Let us now consider the broader geopolitical implications, because this is ultimately what matters most for understanding where the world is going. We are living through a period of profound geopolitical transition. The unipolar moment, that period after the Cold War, when American power was essentially unchallengeable, is over. We have moved into a more genuinely multipolar world where China has risen to become a peer competitor in economic terms and is rapidly closing the gap militarily, where Russia, whatever one thinks of its actions in Ukraine, remains a nuclear superpower with significant regional influence, and where a network of what I would call resistant states, Iran, North Korea, and various non-state actors aligned with them, have been actively probing and challenging American power in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. In that context, this strike on an Iranian warship has to be understood as an American attempt to reassert deterrence, to send a message that there are limits to how far Washington is willing to be pushed, and that when those limits are crossed, the response will be swift and overwhelming. The Biden administration and later the Trump administration both struggled with this question of how to calibrate deterrence against Iran and its proxies without triggering a wider war. The Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, the drone and missile attacks on American bases in the region, the slow erosion of American deterrence credibility, all of this created pressure within the American national security establishment to do something dramatic, to restore the fear, if you will, to remind adversaries that the consequences of attacking American interests are real and severe. But here is the profound tension in that strategy. Reasserting deterrence through military strikes is a double-edged instrument. It can work if the adversary concludes that further provocation is too costly and backs down, but it can also fail if the adversary feels that backing down is politically impossible, or if the strike is seen as an act of aggression that justifies an escalatory response. And the history of American military intervention in the Middle East is not, I'm afraid, a particularly encouraging guide here. Shock and awe has a way of producing unpredictable second and third order effects that the strategists in Washington do not always fully anticipate. Consider the regional dimension of this. The Arab states of the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, they have their own complicated relationships with Iran. They fear Iranian power, they welcome American military presence as a counterweight. But they also desperately do not want the region to descend into a full-scale war that would devastate their economies, their oil infrastructure, and their political stability. So they will be watching Washington's next moves with deep anxiety, hoping that this strike is a controlled, bounded act of deterrence and not the opening move in a larger conflict. And then there is Israel, which has of course been engaged in its own profound military confrontation with Iranian proxies, with Hamas in Gaza, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and which has conducted its own strikes against Iranian assets and personnel over the years. Israel's strategic calculus here is complex. On one hand, anything that degrades Iranian military capability and credibility serves Israeli interests. On the other hand, Israel is acutely aware that a broader American-Iranian war could draw it in directly, with consequences for its own population that are deeply concerning. Russia and China, meanwhile, will use this moment in ways that serve their own interests. Moscow will point to the strike as evidence of American aggression and imperialism, language that plays well in the global south, where skepticism of American military power is deeply rooted. Beijing will study the LRASM's performance with intense technical interest, because China's own Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, is the adversary that American anti-ship weapons like the LRASM are ultimately designed to deter. Chinese naval strategists will be running simulations, updating their threat assessments, and thinking very carefully about the implications of what they have just observed. And that brings me to perhaps the most important long-term consequence of this strike, which is what it tells us about the future of naval warfare. We are entering an era in which the old assumptions about how navies fight, assumptions built around carrier groups, surface combatants, unmanned aircraft, are being challenged by new technologies. Autonomous weapon systems, hypersonic missiles, drone swarms, directed energy weapons, all of these are reshaping what naval combat looks like and who can effectively wage it. The LRASM, with its autonomous guidance and stealth characteristics, is in some ways a preview of where anti-ship warfare is going. And as these weapons proliferate, as China develops its own equivalents, as Iran acquires more sophisticated anti-ship capabilities, the dynamics of naval power in the Persian Gulf and beyond will continue to shift in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict. What we can say with some confidence is this: the strike on the Iranian warship has changed something. It has altered the calculus. It has raised the stakes. It has forced every government in the world with a stake in Middle Eastern stability, and that is nearly every government in the world, given the region's centrality to global energy markets, to reassess their positions and their contingency plans. The question of whether this leads to a broader conflict or whether it succeeds in its apparent goal of restoring deterrence and forcing Iranian restraint will depend on decisions that will be made in Tehran, in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Riyadh, and in Beijing over the coming days and weeks. And I want to be honest with you, as I always try to be. I do not know how this ends. Nobody does. Military escalation has a momentum of its own, a logic that can carry events far beyond what any individual decision maker intended or wanted. The history of the 20th century is full of conflicts that began with what seemed like controlled, limited military actions and spiraled into catastrophes that nobody had anticipated and nobody had wanted. That does not mean this will necessarily follow the same path, but it means we should be clear-eyed and honest about the risks, rather than comforting ourselves with false certainty about how rational actors will behave under pressure. What I do know is this: the world is watching, and what happens next in the waters of the Middle East will tell us a great deal about where we are truly heading as a global community, whether toward a managed, multipolar order where even rival powers find ways to avoid catastrophic conflict, or towards something far more dangerous and far less predictable. We will continue to follow this story very closely as events develop and bring you the most careful and honest analysis that we can, because in moments like this, that is what genuinely matters.